Hi guys, my name's Sanjay Gupta. I'm a cardiologist in York, and over the past few days I've made a lot of new friends in various Facebook groups, and today it became apparent to me that a lot of people would really value finding out or knowing a little bit about how to tell the difference between PACs, PSVCs, and PVCs. And I suppose the utility of that is if you know a little bit about them and what they mean, then it allows you to understand the condition a little bit better. So, okay, let's get started. This is going to be quite complex. I've had quite a busy day, so I'm quite exhausted, but I'll try. And I really wanted to try and do this video. Okay, so the first thing to say is that to understand this, and I'm going to keep it very simple, and I'm going to try and, so I'm just going to show you how I know it, and I'm not going to try and use too much in the way of technical jargon, so forgive me. But basically, the first thing to try and understand is how the normal heart works, okay? Basically, you have 4 chambers in the heart. You have the atria at the top, and then you have the ventricles at the bottom. In the atria, there is a part of the atrium which is called the pacemaker. And the pacemaker can be, the analogy is that the pacemaker is a guy who sits at the top of the atria and he beats a drum. The noise of that drum goes down the atria, down the AV node, and into the ventricles, and the echo comes back, and when the echo dies, the guy beats the drum again. Okay. Now, if you look at the ECG when that happens, this is what happens. When the guy beats the drum, the first thing is that there is the noise that goes into the atrium there. Then it goes to the ventricles, and then eventually, after coming back from the ventricles, the echo dies down, and at this point, the guy will then start beating the drum again. Okay, so this is what it looks like. This is called a P wave. There's a QRS complex here, and there is a T wave here. Okay, so that's what a normal ECG looks like. So basically, what the guy does is here. Sorry, I can show you. Your pacemaker fires. The sound goes down. The impulse goes down into the ventricles, comes out. The echo dies down. The pacemaker fires again, and so on and so forth. And the distance between these is approximately the same. Okay. Now, PACs stand for premature atrial complexes. PSVCs stand for premature supraventricular complexes, and PVCs stand for premature ventricular complexes. So by definition, they have to be premature, which means that they have to occur before the echo has died down, i.e. someone else fires before the echo dies down. Okay, so the guy, your pacemaker beats the drum, but before the echo dies down, someone else fires. And that is the hallmark. They are premature. Okay, so here we go. This is what a premature ventricular complex looks like. You get the drummer fires, and then suddenly someone else fires. Okay, so they're premature. If they occur late, then they're called escape beats. That tells you that there's something wrong with the pacemaker. He's not firing when the echo dies down, and something else then fires to compensate. Those are called escape beats. But PVCs, PACs, they're premature. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. The second thing to bear in mind is that someone else can fire from anywhere within the heart. So you can have a person sitting there firing or beating a drum from outside the pacemaker in the atrium. That you can have that in the atrioventricular node or in the ventricle. The important issue to remember is that the lower down you go, or where the impulse comes from, the less likely it is to cause a meaningful contraction. Okay, so if your pacemaker is firing the impulse, that will cause the most meaningful contraction. If there is a premature complex which comes from the atrium, a PAC, that will cause a slightly less meaningful contraction of the heart. If it's lower down in the supraventricular AV node, it will cause an even less meaningful contraction. And finally, if it's in the ventricle, it will cause an even less meaningful contraction. And ultimately, the whole point about this, the only reason these are important is because when you have premature complexes, no matter where they come from, they are less effective at generating a meaningful contraction of the heart. Okay, so if they are less strong, if they cause a less meaningful contraction of the heart, that means less blood goes around the body. So if you have 50 or 100 in one after the other, then that means that there's a substantial reduction in the blood supply that's going around the body. And this is why they're important. The only reason they're important is because they're causing less blood to come out of the heart for whether that's 1 beat or whether that's 100 beats. But the higher up the impulse is generated, the premature impulse is generated, the more meaningful the contraction will be. So I would much rather have my pacemaker firing, but if my pacemaker isn't firing, I would much rather have the premature complex coming from my atrium rather than my ventricle, because if it's in the ventricle, it will be less meaningful. And this is why these are felt as missed beats, because they cause a less meaningful contraction. Now, the second thing to say is that the lower the contraction, i.e. in the heart, the broader the QRS complex gets, okay? So if your impulse is being released in the atrium, you will still get a P wave, you'll get a premature complex. So instead of waiting that time, you've got a premature complex here, but it's still got a P wave. Can you see this little notch? This P wave is different from this P wave. So it tells me that the impulse is still being produced in the atria, but it's not being produced in the pacemaker where the normal pacemaker is. So I would call this a premature atrial complex, a PAC, because there's a P wave. And so I know it's coming from the atrium, okay? Then if you have this where you've got a P wave here, normal complex, and then you get something which is again thin, i.e. it's still a narrow complex, i.e. the width of this QRS duration is still narrow, then I know, and there's no P wave, then I would call that a supraventricular complex. So I know it's from above the ventricle because it hasn't become broad. Remember, the lower down the impulse comes from, the broader it gets. So I know that this is not in the ventricle because it's still not broad. And by broad, I mean more than 120 milliseconds. So if you had the ECG paper, you would find that this should be no more than 3 small squares, the width of this. And because this is also less than 3 small squares, I can tell you that this is a supraventricular complex. It's premature, it's come in early, it's narrow complex, so it's supraventricular. And I can't see a P wave, an abnormal P wave, so I know I can't call it a premature atrial complex. I can only call it a premature supraventricular complex. Further down, okay, so if the impulse is coming from the ventricle, then it becomes much broader. And here we go, there is another one. Now here, you've got a normal P wave, and look at this. This is so broad, so much broader than this, okay? And when you see that it's so broad, you know that that impulse has come from the ventricle. And you know that this impulse is going to be very ineffective at causing a heartbeat, okay? And that's why it's important. Now, if you get 2 or 3 in a row and they look identical, you would call that a unifocal ventricular ectopics, i.e. they come from the same place in the ventricle. The impulse is being generated from the same place. If they look different, but they're all broad, then you can say that's a multifocal ventricular complex. And that's the same with supraventricular complexes or atrial complexes. If they look the same, they're abnormal, but all the ectopics look the same, you know they're unifocal. If they look different, but they're narrow complex, then you could call them multifocal supraventricular complexes. And if they are broad complex, then you know they're ventricular complexes. If they are broad complex and they all look different, then you know they're multifocal ventricular complexes. Ultimately, the most important thing to be aware of is that if you have a strong heart, then the heart will cope, because whatever the ventricular complex does, it's not going to cause a very meaningful contraction, but because you have a strong heart, there will still be some blood going around. But if you have a weak heart, then it is highly unlikely that the blood will go around. And that is why the first thing, whenever you get lots of complexes, lots of premature beats, is to try and work out whether you have a structurally strong heart or not, whether you should have an echocardiogram. If you have a weak heart, ultimately they are all, you know, they all pose a more sinister proposition. Whereas if you have a strong heart, then in general, you know, they're more benign. So this is the way how to differentiate between them. There are some people who get something called SVC or supraventricular complexes with aberration. Now, if you have a conduction system disturbance, then you will have broad complexes anyway. And in those people, you can have a supraventricular complex, but because all their complexes are going to be broad, even that supraventricular complex will look broad. And that's why it can be quite difficult sometimes to distinguish between PVCs and PSVCs with aberration. Okay, but the big difference between the two is this, that if you have ventricular complexes, then your atria are still doing their own thing, and the ventricle is just releasing these extra impulses. So you will still see P waves, but they will not be related to the QRS complexes. On the other hand, with SVCs or an aberration, because the impulses are coming from the top of the heart to the bottom, there will always be, there will either not be a P wave, or there will be a relationship between the P wave and the QRS. So a hallmark of ventricular complexes is that they there is no association, there is dissociation between the P waves and the QRS complexes. So this is how you tell the difference, okay? Ultimately, what matters is, if you have a strong heart, it's okay. If you have a weak heart, then all of them will cause a reduction in the blood that comes out of the heart. But particularly the PVCs cause a lot less blood coming out of the heart. And therefore, if you have a series of 100 together, then that means that there is a lot less blood going around the body. There's a lot less blood coming back to the heart and supplying the heart muscle, and the heart will therefore start failing, and then you can develop things like ventricular fibrillation, etc. So I hope this was useful. I'm sorry, it's a bit technical, but I hope it's useful. So all I think you should remember is, the first thing is that they are premature. Secondly, they all cause a reduction in the amount of blood coming out of the heart for that beat. But the lower down the impulse is, that the premature impulse comes from, the less blood will come out of it. And the lower down it is, the broader the complex on the ECG. Okay, so I hope that was useful, and thank you for listening. And I'll try and answer some of your questions on Facebook shortly. All right. I don't know how to do the Q&A, but oh, by the way, if you wanted to get in touch with me, you can do so by yourcardiology.co.uk, and I can talk to you over the phone and do a virtual consultation. On the other hand, if you want to follow me on Twitter, this is my Twitter handle, and then of course some of you know me from Facebook. The only thing I will request is, if you could please share these, because there's a lot of people out there who would, I think, would benefit from these videos, and that would mean a lot to me. So take care, have a good evening, and thanks for listening.